if a random person throws an insult at you or says something that could be hurtful, these things only land when there is a part of you that agrees with them. It's like, if someone calls me an asshole right now, I'm going to be unfazed because there is no part of myself that believes I am an asshole anymore. In the past, that was different. In the past, there was a part of me who was very afraid of oh no, I might be an asshole. So if someone calls me an asshole, that would provoke a very strong reaction. I was like, no, I'm not an asshole. Because I needed to kind of defend myself against my own part criticizing myself. But so now that I am more secure in myself and in who I am, I know that someone's random opinion can't really make a difference in my life.
Do you get stressed at all or nervous about doing these, or you're just totally relaxed?
I guess it depends. Right now, I feel quite relaxed. But sometimes, like when I was doing my own podcasts, my own recordings, if I didn't know the person well in advance and I didn't really have a chance to see how they react to things, then sometimes I'd be a bit nervous, as in how can I make sure this conversation goes in a way that is interesting and pleasant and stuff like that. But usually it was fine.
And what about if people are asking you questions?
I don't get nervous about people asking me questions at all because it's so simple. I have this commitment to integrity, so I just answer truthfully, which makes it very simple. Like back in the day when I was still trying to control the environment, I had to remember which kind of elements of control I would, integrate where, and then that's stressful. But now, yeah, I'm just myself and I just tell the truth. It's easy.
Amazing. When did you make this shift?
Well, I think it's a gradual shift, like most things. But this commitment to integrity, I think, is something that I discovered maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it's such a powerful tool for reshaping your relationship with yourself. It's really at the core of my practice.
Cool. I guess mine, it's more like re-listening, I just re-listened to the episode we did before. Okay, yeah, context for the audience. Joachim has been you were on episode 1 and then episode 80. So episode 1 was your growing up story and your life as a composer. And then a transition out. Episode 80, chapter 2 was about the business or you designing your whole life. That is so cool. That is so interesting for someone who wants to intentionally design their life and figure out how money can flow in and whatever, and you can live as you want and you can be a nomad if you want and all of that. I was re-listening thinking this is, I don't know what you think about manifestation or if you just would cringe at that word, but it just sounds like the process as you described it, because you literally clearly designed your life of what it's going to look like. And then it's so intentional. So the business you ended up making, it was so clearly I'm doing B2C, I'm doing something digital. And then the opportunity ended up coming in. In the woo-woo world, you'd be oh yeah, that's the manifestation came in because the universe gave you what you wanted because you had the clear intention. But I don't know if you ever think about things in those terms.
Well, I do, but I don't necessarily have the same narrative about it as some people do, So I think manifestation is real in the sense that you have to have clarity in order to be able to make the right decisions. And having clarity means that you have a pretty good image of where you want to get to, and then you can manifest that by taking action. It doesn't just happen to you, right? It doesn't just come to you. You have to take action. And the difference is that if you have a clear vision, if you have that in your mind, then when you encounter the possible decisions, you will know which ones will lead to where you want to go, instead of just kind of randomly making it up as you go along. I think that's the That's the difference. So I'm a strong proponent of having clarity before you move. It's, yeah, one of the 3 pillars I had when I was making my business.
Cool. And then I guess it's not just the vision, it's also the belief, which you clearly had, which again comes through like taking some action. Like you went and read 4-Hour Work Week and like books like that. And so it's like, oh, okay, it's possible. And this is how, rather than, because I feel like a lot of people, and that's what we talked about in the first episode, that the start, you know, that you were this really successful composer, but there's like these issues in the music industry. Or not issues, it's just the way it works, that you have to, you know, get money from elsewhere and whatever, all those stresses. And it's like, at what point a lot of people would just complain and be like, this sucks, like the world's so unfair, like artists aren't paid and rich people will control everything or whatever. But you were like, at some point you just stop making excuses and you create the life you want. But a lot of people don't even get to that point because it's just like they can't see outside, or they've never seen what's possible outside the people around them. So you obviously had that.
Yeah, but you raise a really important point, actually. I mean, having examples is such a powerful tool. Knowing that things are possible changes everything. And the belief in yourself kind of grows gradually, because it's not because I read the 4-Hour Work Week that I necessarily immediately believed that I could do this. But I was intrigued enough by someone else describing the process to kind of step into it myself. And then along the way, you notice that, oh yes, if I take responsibility and I make decisions that are different from the decisions that I used to make, then different things happen. The outcomes are different. And gradually that gives you more and more evidence that you can take full responsibility for the life you have.
Did you do the challenges in that book, by the way? Because I just read it, and he has challenges when it's like make eye contact with people on the street, which I started doing, which is really fun. But then he has lie on the ground.
Yeah, I definitely didn't do most of them.
Well, one of them is just ask people for their phone numbers, which I don't know if you do that anyway.
No.
Really? You wouldn't ever ask someone out in a cafe?
I've never done that, so no, I don't think so.
Wow. Wait, what about at a bar?
Nope.
What happens? People just give you their numbers.
I think connections happen mostly in a context where people already have some kind of second degree of separation kind of things, like, you know, people who know you, or contexts that feel relatively safe. But in a bar or a restaurant or a cafe or on the street, I've never met anyone. Well, I meet people, but I don't engage with them in that way.
Huh. Okay. I didn't do that.
This is a long story, though.
Okay. And then, yeah, because I did those parts. No, because he has a part that's like lie on the ground in the middle of, in public. And I did that.
Wow.
It was terrifying. But then the rest of the book, I was like, yeah, I'm not really interested in this. But it was interesting to learn about him. Anyway. Okay. All of this to say is, so we did all of that and then we didn't get up to your next chapter, which is what we're talking about now. We got to the point that you unwound yourself from the business. So you set the business up in a way that you could remove yourself. And then it was, I think you said it was even more profitable because it meant like reducing headcount and making things more efficient. Okay, all of this is to finish my original point about integrity. Like, I feel like in that conversation, listening to myself back, I was in integrity, but the thing I need is more self-compassion, because I'll listen to myself and cringe because it's like, oh my God, what the fuck was I talking about? And because my thinking's changed so much, which is funny because we were also talking about that it's like, we don't know what we're going to be doing in 6 months. So why would we keep projecting into the future? But it's just funny when you hear yourself talking about yourself as if you know who you are, and that, I don't know, because even as we were talking about that, still some of the things we're saying was part of some identity that have now gone, and that was 6 months ago. But I was in integrity. It's just how do you, I don't know, do you ever find that when you listen to like a younger version of self? Do you just have compassion? Like, oh yeah, he was saying the things that were true for him then. Now I've changed.
Yeah, I don't even think about that. I mean, that's obvious to me. Like a year ago, I believed different things. I said different things. They're not radically different, right? They're still adjacent, but some of my things have, some of my beliefs or some of my desires, let's say, have changed. But I have no attention towards the desires or beliefs of my previous selves because they were real at that time. And I do sometimes have this idea of like, oh, yeah, I was young and naive at the time. Like, it's weird because in retrospect, that's so easy to say. But at the time, that was absolutely what was happening and what was true for me. So I have no regrets or no tension around that ever.
Cool. And so if you say something today that in 6 months won't be true, it's like, well, it was true today.
Exactly. Yeah. I also don't have to think about that. Like, oh my God, can I say this? Because it might not hold true. So what? The only problem, of course, is that when you have a podcast like you do and like I did, because I stopped mine, there are some ideas of me that are now permanently residing in that podcast that people can listen to in a couple of years, maybe, that don't necessarily reflect my current state anymore or what I believe now. And those people won't know that unless they engage with me. But that's just, the price to pay for making work public in a way. I have the same thing with my compositions from when I was a musician. Some of my work doesn't resonate with me anymore at all. But I don't want to disavow it. There are cases of like creators or artists, maybe even writers, I don't know, who like burn their early work or something because they really don't want people to see it. But I'm like, no, this is who I was. This is what I made back then. And I may not believe the same things now, but I also don't want to destroy that history.
Can you think of anything off the top of your head from the podcast that stands out as like not being in alignment anymore?
Yeah, I think my whole position on, let's call it romantic relationships, has shifted quite considerably since my last conversation on my own podcast. I think in that last conversation, I was still very much in that phase in which I was focusing on my self-partnership. Like I was self-partnered and I didn't really believe that I was going to look for an external partner. And now that has shifted completely where I'm like, oh, wow, I think I'm ready to have a wife or something like that, to put it in extreme terms. And it's really interesting to notice that and to see that shift and the specific circumstances that have led to that. But it also doesn't feel like contradiction. It's just like I've uncovered a part of myself that desired that all along probably, but was repressed by other things. And right now, it's not like I've replaced one desire with the other. Both of those desires are still in me. Like there is a part in me that is very independent, that is very happily self-partnered. And there's another part that desires a sacred union. And that seems like a contradiction, but I don't think it is. It's just different side of myself. And I accept and I honor both of them. And I remain kind of non-attached to what path I will take. Let's call it that.
Oh my God, that's so exciting. I'm so excited for you and what's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm curious too.
That I was actually going to ask that because I saw, you did your last episode where you were interviewed in February, was it? So I was going to ask if anything, I guess it's been 6 months or nearly 6 months.
Yeah, it was published in February, but the conversation was from last year actually. So yeah.
So I was going to ask how much has changed in that time. But let's go back to where we left because otherwise we'll never get the chronological narrative. So
Chapter 4.
Yeah. If I just keep talking about myself being in integrity or not. Okay. So you settled in Bulgaria at some point. You had a nomad life of like 9 years while running the business. And then what was the timing from when did you move to Bulgaria and when did you start stepping away from the business? What was that timing?
I moved to Bulgaria about 5 years ago, and I started disentangling myself from running the business exactly 2 years ago.
Oh, really? So right before we met in London, when you came to London over for
If
summer.
that was 2 years ago, then yeah.
I think that was 2 years ago. Yeah, when we did.
I have terrible temporal memory. I never know.
Huh, okay. And interesting. Wait, but wouldn't you remember that? Because it was like you came to London for 3 months. That was a big thing.
Yeah. But if you told me like that was 3 years ago, I'd probably be like, oh, yeah, maybe.
Oh, yeah. But do you remember in relation to the stepping away from the business that happened right before
Yes,
that?
yes, that had already happened. Yes, absolutely. I was in London to kind of have a period of change so that I could figure out or start letting go and figure out what was next for me. That was the start of that kind of phase.
Cool. Okay, so that's what we want to hear about, the last 2 years.
Yes.
And you
Okay.
already had the podcast at that point.
Yeah, I've been doing the podcast for 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was the podcast kind of like an opening to the next chapter?
That's an interesting question. I've never framed it that way. I think it's related because the podcast obviously has such a different kind of theme, right? So I think the podcast is definitely something that is closer to what's going to happen with me after the business identity has dissolved, because the podcast is all about this idea of relating to self and healing and I guess spiritual growth, if you want to call it that. And I suspect that is also what my next life phase is going to be about, or at least it's going to be centered around that. It's going to be about surrender mostly. That's the way I feel it now. So the three phases basically is just like, it's first I was an artist, then, or that was my narrative, my self-narrative, right? I'm an artist. Then my self-narrative shifted to I'm now an entrepreneur with this very specific kind of goal with an entrepreneurship. And now I am still in the phase after 2 years of letting that identity of entrepreneurship dissolve, because I still feel a lot of my narratives are around that. And while that dissolving is happening, there's this other process going on. And I can't really say too much about that yet, because I feel, unlike the second phase, this entrepreneurship was a very kind of intentional development, right? I had very clear reasons and I chose to do this. I think the way I'm approaching this now is much more to let the ego narrative of the entrepreneur dissolve and to then gradually and very gently just kind of allow whatever's next to emerge from me, instead of choosing a thing, instead of saying like, oh, I'm going to be an artist again, or I'm going to become whatever it is, a mason, or whatever I'm curious about. I'm just going to wait, and I'm going to sit, and I'm going to listen. And I'm listening mostly to what's happening inside of me, but I'm also listening to the world. And that means humans around me, but not only humans, also just like the natural world. I try to be in nature a lot. I try to listen, like what's happening here? Where am I? What am I? How can I contribute to this thing that we're in, this life, So it's a much gentler and slower process than anything I've done before.
Oh. And in what ways do you feel like you've still held on to the entrepreneur narrative?
Well, there's two ways. There's the external and internal way, right? So externally, I still get quite a lot of people who ask me questions about that. And I notice that when that happens, my mind kind of flips back into that mindset where like, oh yeah, I've done this. And I have information about that. I have some things I can share. And it feels like I'm switching on like an old channel inside of myself to do that. And then internally also, I noticed that sometimes when I am just going through life and I encounter situations, I notice that an entrepreneur mindset comes up to kind of deal with them, which is like, oh, how can I solve this problem in terms of what's the value? How can I create an MVP for myself? What can I do to like grow into a solution that will serve this market, if you want to put it that way? And that's a general approach to life that I see has value, but it also has its limits. So I'm trying to, let's say, hold that lightly. I value that perspective, but I don't want that to be my daily operational mode.
And is that because you want to go deeper?
Yeah, it's because I want to go deeper. If by deeper you mean kind of like looking what's inside, like in my subconscious, in my archetypal beliefs, what are the symbols and archetypes that are present in me? What is my context also? I've been thinking a lot more about my lineage, like where do I come from? Who are these people? What was important to them? What has happened that I have stepped away from that ecosystem? Because that has been a very important moment in my own development. And I also realized that I am the very, very first person from my lineage to do that. Like everybody before me kind of always stayed in the same place and only made small changes. And I've been quite different in that sense. So yeah, I'm listening to that. I'm listening to what's happening inside of me, to what's the relationship with this whole idea of a lineage, and my place in the world also literally. Like the place where I am now, Sofia, has become a place that, although it's very comfortable, I feel it represents a previous version of me. I think Sofia was ideal for my late stage entrepreneurship. It's a place where I can focus. It's a place where I can do deep work. It's a place where I have employees, where there's an ecosystem that allows me to grow a business. But that is not anymore what's alive for me. So I am now also questioning me being here, because this place was chosen within that mindset, chosen within that persona of the entrepreneur. And so I think it's very likely that I will move away from this space as soon as I have clarity about what is unfolding next.
Exciting. Yeah, because we talked about that in the last episode. It's interesting because you were a nomad, but then it was like you were paying tax in Belgium, which isn't ideal. And then, yeah, the various reasons why you chose Sofia. So do you have any idea what it could be next? Or it could be anything. Like it could be Japan or something.
Well, I'm fairly certain it isn't Japan, because I've tried that already, in the sense that I just have made that exercise inside of my mind, right? And I know that it's not a place where I can develop my full potential. Let's put it that way. I think Japan is a very comfortable place where I can live a very good life. But it's not a place that will support my flourishing into this next phase of, the way I see it is also kind of like stepping more into my power, even. I believe there is a personal power that I hold that I've been avoiding for most of my life, both as an artist and as an entrepreneur. And now I feel like that's my mission. Like I want to be able to fully embody that power. And Japan is definitely not the place where people can feel truly empowered. Or no, that's not right. I will rephrase that and say it's not a place where I can feel fully empowered by the surroundings. I have no idea yet. I was in Bali earlier this year, and that felt very juicy. That felt very nice, mostly in terms of surrender, like surrendering to what is so much more obvious in Bali somehow, because nature has such a strong presence there. It's such a vibrant, kind of alive place. And it was so easy to be truly grateful for just being while I was there. So that's something that attracts me, and I want to go there again and figure out what that's about. But it's definitely not an end destination right now in my mind. It's more like a space where I will sit and listen more to what emerges from me.
And in what way do you feel like you haven't stepped into your power throughout your life, or why?
Well, the why, I think, is easy to point at. I think power is scary, right? It both from perspective of responsibility. When you fully embody your power, you are truly responsible. But the other part is that the world is often very resistant to power. People are scared of people who are in their power. And I remember distinctly that a big part of my upbringing and my education was to kind of make sure that I didn't step into my power. It was very geared towards stay small, don't do anything crazy, just behave normally, fit in. And all of those things kind of hold one back from embodying their true power, because the power that we all have can be quite different one from the other, right? And I think those differences in most societies are not celebrated, but kind of curtailed into more normalcy, I guess. So that process was very strong during most of my childhood and teenage years. And what is that power? That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure I know. I think it has to do with truth and integrity for me, because that's what feels most alive in myself. And I notice that for many people, again, that is very scary. Many spaces, many circumstances in this world demand that people do not speak their truth and do not act from integrity. And I would like to contribute to changing that, because I've noticed from my own life that the things we're scared of usually don't happen when we step into truth and integrity. Things get better, if anything. So maybe that's part of the mission, but this is wild speculation for now.
What comes to mind when you think of the spaces where truth and integrity isn't encouraged?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is families. When I hang around people who have a family, with partner, kids, I see so many mechanisms in which people avoid saying what's actually true in order to keep the peace, or to not be scared, to not frighten others, to keep a balance maybe also. And I just don't think that's the best way of organizing family. And that probably also stems from the fact that my family definitely was very bad at truth and integrity. The other obvious example is workspaces. So many people, when they talk about what's difficult for them in the workplace, it's all about not saying the truth to their direct superiors, to their colleagues, to the people they're managing. It's all about managing information, to kind of like withholding things that are actually true, but nobody wants to hear. People are really afraid of telling the truth, especially about how they feel. Like, emotions are usually not welcome in those kind of spaces. I tend to believe that emotions are extremely important in the way that they give us information about what's happening for us. And certainly in my own company, I have tried to create as much space as possible for truth and emotional expression. And I've had very good results with that. So I think change is meaningful in that area.
Is that something you had to learn?
Yes, 100%. This didn't come naturally to me, because I was raised in a completely different kind of perspective. It's only when I really started to think about this that it kind of became obvious to me, like, wait, why am I withholding the truth from my employees or something? Or why would I want them to withhold the truth from me? If they don't like a decision I make, if they feel bad about something, if they need something, but they're afraid to tell me, all of these things actually are information that helps me run the business more efficiently in the end. And if that means that a person is not in the right place, then why not just find someone else? And it's the same with relationships, right? It's like so many people are afraid of losing someone, so they don't really speak their truth. But my perspective now is the more you speak your truth, the better your relationships can become, because you can align the people with what you actually believe and actually desire. If you don't express your desires or your beliefs, then you're always going to be surrounded by people who think you are someone else than you actually are.
Mm. And then, of course, there is grief. So it's to go through the phase of, I thought this person was the perfect employee or partner or whatever, and I let myself grieve.
Yes, the avoidance of grief is one of the main reasons for people not telling the truth to themselves, right? Because that's an important part of truthfulness and integrity, is allowing yourself to know your own truth, which is hard.
So in what ways would you, like, what would the reasons be for you not saying the truth in situations? Because a common one is people pleasing, but I'm not sure if that's how it showed up for you.
Yeah, I was definitely a people pleaser. I was definitely hyper aware of how people felt around me, and I felt it was my responsibility not to make them feel bad, which is toxic. I mean, but that's the pattern that I grew up in. So that's what I did for a very long time. Other reasons for not telling the truth is to not be ostracized, right? To, like, if you're in a community and some weird shit is happening, but you kind of are attached to the community, you don't want to step away, then you're like, yeah, I'm not going to speak about that publicly. That's how enabling works. That's how so many cases of abuse happen, whether it's emotional, verbal, physical abuse, or even sexual abuse. It's because people remain silent when they should speak up, because they're afraid of being cast out of a community, a job, a family, whatever it is, a church. And in many ways, I think I practiced all of the above, right, throughout my life. It's also because almost all of the people around me were also doing that. It's like a collective illusion that we live in very often. And it's really hard to be the first one to kind of like pop that bubble. And I think that's part of the reason that I needed to remove myself from my primary ecosystems in order to be able to become strong enough in myself to then take responsibility from the inside and go like, wait, this is not how I want to live anymore. I want to actually speak up. I want to tell my truth. And I want to live in integrity. And if other people around me can't handle that or don't want that, that's their problem, not mine. Which also leads to the fact that obviously I've had to make some really difficult decisions around this.
Like what?
Like breaking the relationship with my mother, for example. Yeah, that's a part of that. That's a result of that desire for truthfulness, integrity, and being in my own power.
And did a lot of that come up in the music industry, like pressure to...
That's such an interesting question, because very recently in Belgium, so in the ecosystem that I was active in as an artist, quite a few stories have come to light from people basically calling out some of the big names, as in like, hey, you have a toxic leadership style. You did things as a leader of, you know, this, whatever it is, festival or concert hall or ensemble or whatever. The way that you handled this was not okay, right? It was really toxic. And that's a thing that has always existed in the music and also the theater spaces that I know. And that somehow, as a teenager and then in my early 20s, growing up in that, you kind of think it's normal, or you learn to accept it as normal because it's just all around. You know, conductors screaming at people for some reason just because they're angry and stuff like that. And not all of them are as bad. You know, some of them are just kind of light, but still, it's not nice. It's not a nice environment. So it felt really interesting to read these kind of reports now in the news, basically, people saying like, hey, for 15 years, we've been dealing with this really toxic leadership style. It's time this stops. This can't go on anymore. And reading all that, I really reflected on like, oh yeah, it's so true. Like for decades, I was active in an industry that was very bad at helping people speak up when abuse happened. It was always just covered and seen as normal by almost everyone because that was the way that you could continue to be active in it. Had you spoken up, you would have been removed. And I'm very happy that this is now slowly changing and that there are people actually, you know, speaking up. But yeah, for sure, the whole cultural sector as I knew it was full of people taking advantage, abusing people in many different ways, mostly also just by not paying decent wages and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a very tough change to make, I think.
So do you see yourself as a very different person now to back then?
Yes. Yes, I am definitely very different.
What are some of the main changes?
Well, I think the biggest change is that I now have healthy boundaries, or I have a story that I have healthy boundaries. So I have a fairly good sense of who I am, of what I want and what I don't want. And I am no longer afraid to express that to the world. And I make decisions based on what I want and what I don't want. In the past, I wasn't able to do that. In the past, I had basically no boundaries, and I was always just saying yes when I thought that it was required of me, or when other people would look favorably upon me if I said yes to something I didn't want to do. I think that's the biggest change and is at the core of all the other things that have unfolded, like this idea of wanting to be truthful and living in integrity simply isn't possible if you don't have healthy boundaries. So it's only because of having boundaries and holding them that you start to be able to live in your own integrity. That's the main change.
And so did that fear of being exiled or whatever it was, I mean, that's a fear that I live with. Did
I hear you.
that just gradually, like as you took action, you saw it's okay, like there will always be people who are.
Yeah, well, I would say there's three sides to that. The first is, if you start having good boundaries, toxic people disappear from your life because they can't manipulate you anymore. That's a net positive in my book. The second thing is that by creating a much better relationship with myself, I started to need less and less external validation in terms of like, I'm only worth something if other people want to hang out with me. Like, no, if people don't want to hang out with me, I still want to hang out with me. You know, I'm here for myself and I can create the life that I want for myself with myself, and that's beautiful. And then the third pillar of that is that once you start living in your truth, then people who actually like you for who you are can start to meet you. And so over the past 5 years or so, I have started developing beautiful relationships with lovely people who love me for who I am and who honor my boundaries. So all in all, it's just fears, right? It's always just fears. The fears we have of being ostracized are actually holding us back from being amongst the people that are our people.
Okay. Yeah, because, okay, mine is weird. I'm wondering what you think about this. Sorry, this is about me, everyone. Um, because I don't have the fear of speaking up. Like, in fact, that's actually, for some reason, I don't know, I think that's part of me being on this earth. Like, I'm always the one speaking up, being like, this isn't right, whatever. Almost to the point that, I don't know, I wouldn't say I take joy in it, but it's like really, it just is so clear that I'm the person that calls these things out. And integrity, I don't know, it's just a integrity thing. It's like something that's always been with me. But my fear is more like being myself, because it's like I'm scared to be that abusive composer. Not that I would be verbally abusing people, but it's like because of because everything that goes on. That's why it was interesting asking where are the spaces, because for me the spaces are like, oh, what if I say the wrong thing and people get upset, but I didn't mean to upset them, but it's not safe, or, you know, words, like my words were accidentally violent, even though I didn't even mean it. So I should just like disappear and never risk like somehow upsetting someone.
Mm.
Which
Yeah, I
again
hear
is
you.
like trying to manage people's emotions.
Exactly. Yeah. I think this stems from a kind of perfectionism, probably. It sounds like you just don't want to make a mistake. Because the important part of not being an abuser, or not being a toxic person, or not being a bad person, if you want to frame it that way, is not that you never hurt people. It's how you show up when you do. Are you able to repair a relationship? Are you showing up with care? And are you mending what you have broken? I think there's a quote from Brené Brown about that, and I never remember quotes exactly, so I can't really say, but I think it's something around the power of mended relationships that have been broken are stronger than they were before. So creating more love in your life, creating better relationships, is not about not making mistakes with people, not hurting them. It's about showing up to mend the wounds over and over again. That's why relationships grow. That's why people trust each other. So it's part of it, really.
Cool. Okay. And then I guess if it's like a random person on the internet, it's like, well, it's
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, this is a situation that's quite difficult for our human brains to comprehend, I think. That's one of the things we have to manage. We have the hardware that we have is designed for small groups and interacting with people who matter to us on a level of life and death. Right? That's why we are so terrified of angering someone or something. A random person on the internet has no influence on your life, really, in reality, unless you allow them to. So if you accidentally say something that, you know, pisses someone off on the internet, nothing happens. You can still mend that relationship if you desire to. That could be a cool way to get to know new people, I guess. But for me, what I try to do in distributing my energy and my attention, because that in the end is one of our greatest challenges, I think, in these days, is that I am very clear around who the people are that I want to invest in. And if I have decided to invest in someone, then I show up and I'm available and I will listen and I will mend, I will heal, I will hear them. If the person is not someone who matters to me, then maybe I'll just let that slide, because why would I invest time and energy and attention in someone that I don't know? Unless I really desire to create a relationship with them, of course.
got it. And then just not being sensitive to if there's like bad energy being like sent towards you.
Yes. Yeah, again, I think that comes back to having really good boundaries. Like just understanding that someone else's opinion of you does nothing if you are in your integrity. Like if that's something that I truly had to learn. I think there's an interesting mechanism there. That is that if a random person throws an insult at you or says something that could be hurtful, these things only land when there is a part of you that agrees with them. So it's not even about what they say. It's like, if someone calls me an asshole right now, I'm going to be unfazed because there is no part of myself that believes I am an asshole anymore. In the past, that was different. In the past, there was a part of me who was very afraid of oh no, I might be an asshole. So if someone calls me an asshole, that would provoke a very strong reaction. I was like, no, I'm not an asshole. Because I needed to kind of defend myself against my own part criticizing myself. That random person just plays the role of messenger, basically, in these cases. But so now that I am more secure in myself and in who I am, I know that someone's random opinion can't really make a difference in my life. And I can just go yeah, I hear you. I hear your story about me. And it's okay. You can have that story about me if you want to. If you're really interested and you're curious, then I can tell you my perspective on your story and I can give you my truth, and that might change your mind or not. I'm not attached. But mostly these people aren't. They're just kind of in their own process.
Cool. Okay, yeah, that's great. So your whole journey of working on the relationship with yourself has been like a 10-year thing or less?
Well, I would say more, but I maybe was less aware of it. Yeah, I think it's a lifelong kind of thing, right? Let's say that I began working on it more intentionally about maybe 12, 13 years ago. And then it has really accelerated in the past 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the past 2 years since you stepped away from the business, we talked about that problem, I guess, you had of, well, now you've designed your life how you want. You have income coming in and you have, and even I was like, oh, but you still have to pay your taxes. You're like, there's absolutely nothing I have to do. You're like, no, even my taxes are automated. So it was like, okay, what to do with the freedom of time?
Yes.
So what have you done? What's it been like the past 2 years?
It's been really interesting in many different ways. And I feel like I've gone through so many phases already in those 2 years that it's hard to remember them all. I think one of the key developments for me in that is that I have now fully embodied the idea of taking full responsibility for my life. It's one thing to think about that or to know it, and it's another thing to actually realize it in yourself, in your body. And since having that freedom of time and space and action, I have been very powerfully confronted with this fact of I am in every moment fully responsible for everything I do in this world. Basically, nothing happens to me or for me unless I take action. And that has been quite scary at times, because the opposite of that coin is that if I don't take action, if I don't do anything, nothing happens. And I've been in that phase for a while where I just I sit in my apartment and I kind of pass the time. And passing the time is not necessarily a negative here. It's I meditate, I do some practices, maybe I read a book, I go for a walk, I make some food, and then the day ends and I'm like, oh, another day has passed. And it wasn't like an empty day. It was meaningful and sometimes beautiful, or sometimes not. But it didn't really have a sense of direction, perhaps. Or at least not the same sense of direction that I perceived in myself when I was either striving to be an artist or striving to be an entrepreneur. Because those things have very kind of measurable outward goals. And now my life has no measurable outcomes for now, unless I consciously decide to make some, right? And I think the measurements now have become much more about the process. It's much more about how grounded do I feel? How much at peace do I feel? How creative do I feel? How joyful do I feel? All these kind of things. But these are things, obviously, as you know, that wax and wane. These are not kind of metrics that you can just like put in a spreadsheet and push a button to make them go in the right direction. That's not how these things work. So becoming way more present to what is actually happening for me in every moment has been a big part of my practice for the past 2 years. And practicing non-judgment about what is actually happening. Noticing like, oh, I have less energy. I feel less joyful. I feel less creative today. That's okay. Nothing needs to happen. It's not like I need to pull a lever to change that right now. It's about acceptance. It's about surrender. And I think that's the most meaningful kind of learning from that period for me.
And it's felt safe to just stay curious and experience these things and not like...
Not always. It's edgy sometimes. Because as I said earlier, this entrepreneur mindset still sometimes steps in and panics and goes like, oh, wait, I don't feel great. I don't feel creative. I must do something. I must take action. I must develop a project. I must work on something. Or something like a moral imperative comes up. Like, but what am I doing for the world? Like, how can I create value for people if I'm just, sitting in my apartment, meditating and reading? And I have now become much better at perceiving those impulses when they come and kind of just sitting with them. But yeah, it's definitely not always felt super safe. At times I have suffered from these states.
And what about meeting people? How do you, like, if you go to a random dinner party and someone says, what do you do? What do you say?
Okay. So first of all, I never go to random dinner parties. That doesn't happen. Occasionally I meet people, I'm introduced to people and they ask me what I do or something like that. And I have a collection of handy narratives that I feel are fitting for the situation, depending on the context. Because it's not always that I have the time and the space to actually explain what's going on, right? So it's like, sometimes I just simply say like, oh, I'm figuring out what my next step is. That's the easiest kind of answer. It's like, yeah, I was an entrepreneur, I had a business, left the business a while ago. Now I'm kind of thinking about what to do next. People get that. People understand that.
And because you're saying it with confidence, you don't attract, like... This is also me selfishly asking this because I attract a lot of questions and it's like, ah. But
what's wrong with questions?
I guess it's more like fear projections about like money and...
yes.
Yeah, like what do you... Yeah, I don't know. But now, yeah, I think I'm good at just being like, yeah, I don't think that far. Because people ask like, oh, okay, but in 3 months from now when you're doing this and then you're going there, but then how will you blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm not thinking about that. But it's actually kind of sad because then I'm like, oh, then you can't relate in the same way because they're like, oh, you're not worried about all this shit that I'm worried about. So what do we talk about now?
Yeah, I don't see that as a problem. If someone figures out in a conversation that they can't relate to me, then that's the truth. And I won't fight that. But I think there is a deeper level on which humans can relate to each other regardless of where they're at. So they might say something like, oh, but how do you deal with that and that? I'm like, I trust myself that whatever happens, I will be able to find a solution for that. And then they might go like, oh my God, I can't relate to you, but they might ask a question about that or something. And then they'll notice that underneath that, I'm also just a human making sense of things in my own way. And I might even have some interesting thoughts that they haven't had before and the other way around. So yeah, there's always a level at which I believe we can communicate really with anyone if we're able to be sensitive to where someone's at. And I think that's become one of my good skills, is that I'm relatively good at meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm. And you don't, well, I guess, do you receive many projections, or you're not worried that much about people's judgments of like...
I receive judgments and projections all the fucking time. And I'm not worried about that at all, because it's inevitable. That's just what the mind does. I do the same. I have projections about everyone I meet, right? There's always some kind of a judgment coming up. I don't necessarily shape my reality around my own judgments and projections. And I try to remain aware at all times that they are indeed just a story I hold. And when communicating about it, I will often frame it that way as well. It's like, hey, Delia, I have a story about you that I'd like to check in with you about. You know, it's like, it seems to me that, and then I can tell you what I think, but I will never frame it as something like, Delia, you are X, Y, Z. You know, that's just not a good way of communicating, I believe.
Cool. What are people... How do you think about yourself in relation to... Because, you know, the whole big movement about like screw work and like escape it and like retire early and fire and whatever. But I've always thought about that. Like, what do those people think they're going to be doing? Because it's like, after 2 weeks on, or whatever, go for a year to Bali or something, but then it's like, then you've got the rest of your life. But it's like, surely they must be talking about that stuff in their forums or whatever, because it's such like a big movement.
I don't know. I'm not really in touch with those kinds of people, so I don't know exactly how those people talk about that. For me, it's very simple. It comes down to aliveness. Where is my aliveness? What do I feel excited about? Where does my energy flow? What do I want to explore? What lights me up? And at times, it seems like there isn't much. And that's okay too. I have learned to accept that, which again is a very powerful move, because that removes the tension, and removing the tension also removes the suffering.
And you're not at risk of like falling into nihilism or depression or those kind of things.
I can only say that so far I seem to not have done that. And I also don't worry about whether or not that could happen to me in the future, because when it happens, again, I trust myself to find ways to deal with that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just worrying about that, because that's the common experience for me. Even when I do have a lot on, it's like, how to get out of it.
See, but that's actually really interesting information, because I believe that kind of fear doesn't actually have anything to do with what's real. Right? So even if you have a lot on your plate and you're doing lots of creative things, you still have that feeling. And I think I don't have that feeling, even if I have absolutely nothing to do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have kind of stepped through that fear, and it hasn't. Sorry, that was like a period of my life, but
Beautiful.
Now it's... Yeah. But even listening to you, it's like, I don't know, my brain's just thinking like I would straight away go into that thing when I couldn't get out of bed. But that might not be true at all anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because this not getting out of bed, I don't know. I wake up in the morning and I have this very simple practice of whenever I gain consciousness, I say hello to the things around me. And I say something like, what an amazingly beautiful day. I get to be alive. And I'm excited about being alive, even if I have no clue what I will do, right? So it's not like, yes, I can work on this project, or I can do this thing, or I will see this person. Sometimes I have absolutely nothing in my calendar. Actually, quite recently, for the very first time in my life, I had absolutely nothing in my calendar for the rest of my days. Like, that literally never happened to me before, where there was nothing, not a single trip, not a single workshop, not a single dinner, nothing, absolutely nothing. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I was still excited to be alive. I was still excited to get out of bed and just like feel my own being in the world.
Amazing. Okay, sorry, this is so funny. I realized I'm also just in this phase at the moment, and it's great. So I'm like, what am I even talking about? But I
Right.
think I was worried. I think I started the phase because it's been 6 months or a bit more that I left my job. I think I started the phase thinking like I'll be planning the whole time for the next phase. But then I just realized like, oh, I'm loving this phase and I'm just living it and it's just
Mm.
unfolding. And I am like living my purpose because I'm like being the person who I am or whatever in every moment. So there's no destination to arrive to. But that's the big disconnect
Yeah.
with other people because, yeah, people don't like that.
Well, people don't like it because it's scary for them, right? Because they use the destination to numb themselves from the fact that they're not comfortable with who they are in some way. And I've done that for so long that I know how that feels very well. It's very easy to have big external goals to work towards in order to just not feel what's going on the inside. But once you actually stop and address that and just look at it and just be with it, that kind of dissolves, in my experience with myself. I can't speak for others, but I think it's actually a necessary part of cultivating that kind of relationship with yourself, is to create the space and the time necessary to be able to feel what's going on. If we're always busy, then there's no way we can actually attend to it.
Yeah. And I think importantly, it's also how, provided you have the financial part sorted out, because of course there's people like in
Of
survival
course.
mode. But then there's
Although I have to say, that's true for me, right? But I do know people for whom that's not necessarily the case. I do know people who almost have nothing, but feel completely at peace and trust that they will have what they need when they need it. And I think that's actually the true definition of abundance. Abundance is not having a lot of stuff. It's just believing that you will have what you need when you need it. And I see people living like that. And I couldn't. I know I couldn't. But it is possible for some.
yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I think for many people in my life, it's a mindset thing because they do have financial abundance, but maybe they have, yeah, because I think what you're alluding to is you can change, there's like there's multiple inputs, but you can change what's coming in, but you can change what's going out. And you don't have to have a massive mortgage and all these other things. Like you can significantly reduce that side. But even, yeah, so people can get in a trap where they think like, oh, well, you're so lucky and I'm not. And I'm could never do that but it's like their mindset is keeping them trapped. Because it's fine if that's a choice, but it's when it's like, no, I'm powerless and you
Mm-hmm.
are just spoiled or something. But it's like,
Yeah.
but you could you're choosing to do that, which is great, like great, but having a big house and a mortgage and stuff, but that's a choice. You're not enslaved by your employer.
Yeah. But many people believe they are, right? Many people believe that they have to make certain choices. And when they make those choices, that enslaves them to a certain kind of life that they feel very bad about, like maybe even resentful. But it's because they also don't honor the fact that they have made those choices. They frame them as like, yeah, but, of course I needed a big house and a car. And, it's not something they see as like, oh, I could have made another choice. And I know because I've been in that mindset as well. It was so clear to me in the past that, I just had to do certain things. It's just a belief.
Mm. And it can also it definitely feels scary if you step away to take like time off to think, but watching a balance go down. And I think that's another thing that I had that as a part that I had to work through in IFS, like a genuine fear that I would starve to death. But I think when you work through that, it is that trust that like the universe will provide for me. I mean, I
Well,
attract those type of questions all the time of like,
yeah.
isn't it so irresponsible, like what you're doing? But it's like, why?
Do you think it is?
Obviously, I think a part of me must be still not fully confident because that's why I keep attracting it. But the more I can, I don't know. But no, I don't think it is. But also the way people see money, I'm like, that's not how money works. Like money, it doesn't sit there. It's not a pile of gold that you're like chipping away at and it disappears. Like money is in the system and it's moving and it's growing and not everything's like purely transactional. Opportunities come from all kinds of places that aren't like a direct transaction. So, because it's money's energy.
Sure. I don't really frame things as, the universe will provide. I think that's a catch-all phrase that doesn't really, it's not very helpful for many people, I think. The way I frame that is more something like, hey, I have lived my life in the way that I have built trust with a wide variety of humans who would be more than happy to step in to help me if I really needed it. I won't go hungry because the friends who love me will feed me. I won't sleep outside because the friends who love me will house me. That's the kind of base level social network security that I have. In many countries that we are fortunate to have grown up in, there is also this layer of state-based security where, if you truly have nothing, you can ask for support and you'll probably get it. But even beyond that, I think the richness of the humans around us is so plentiful. And of course, I realize that that's also something, again, that you have to create for yourself. If I just sit in my room and never connect with anyone and never provide any value to anyone, then I will not have that kind of social network. But I think that for me is truly also something of real worth and value. Not just in transactional terms of like, yeah, they will feed me and house me if I need it, but also in terms of like, this is part of my meaning in this life. Like my meaning is not just in me, it's also in the relationships that I have created and fostered in my life. And that creates value, as in an energy that flows between people, right? Even if it's not expressed in a monetary value.
Yeah. Which is literally like how we evolved in tribes, supporting each other.
Maybe.
Well, why not? And you can't. Well, isn't there that one guy who tried to live totally separate from humans? The film, is it Into the Wild? And then he died.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And it's like, because we do need each other. But not specific. We don't need specific people, which is that fear of being exiled. So if you were sadly exiled by your family or closest people, you can adapt to new people, but you do need some humans.
Yes, we are interdependent. Not just humans, by the way. We also need all kinds of other species and living things, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to eat anything. Or even breathe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then what was the decision to end the podcast?
There's this thing, I feel quite committed to the idea of sticking with something, right? I think I see a lot of people in this day and age where everything is extremely fast. They try something for a couple of days, couple of times, and then they give up if it doesn't work. So for me, the podcast was something that I committed to, and I did it for 3 years, 3 seasons. I published, 76 episodes, I believe, or something like that. And after having done that, I noticed that my audience was not growing. Quite the contrary, the audience was shrinking. So I thought, okay, if what I make with love and with a lot of interest, if what I make doesn't resonate with the world, why would I keep doing it? I could do this just for myself as a kind of like an internal project, but I felt that that energy that I used would be better off being used for something that resonates with more people. Because that's, I think, part of the mission of being human, is to contribute to each other, right? And it's not that the podcast had no listeners. There were people who were very happy listening to all my episodes. But I think if it had been growing organically and slowly, I would have continued. But since that wasn't the case, I was like, you know what? I'm going to rethink what I do with this time and attention. And maybe I can do something that has more impact.
Mm-hmm. And you said last time that the podcast was an opportunity to have interesting conversations with people. So do you just practice that anyway outside the podcast?
I probably have less interesting conversations with people I don't really know than when I had the podcast. But like with every decision, there are always pros and cons, right? So I would say that's definitely a clear con on this side. It's like, yeah, I used to have these wonderful, interesting conversations with people I hardly knew. I don't really have that anymore, but that's okay, because the energy and the time that I've freed up by not doing the podcast anymore can now be directed towards something else. And that's worth more to me.
Cool. And we need to stay tuned to find out what that looks like.
Well, I don't know yet, so I can't tell you, sadly.
But very exciting update is that now you're in the market for a wife.
Yes, that is exciting indeed. I'm very curious.
Cool. Now the intention's out there.
Yes. Yeah, I'm even doing a whole... There's this book, Calling in the One. Don't know if you've heard about it.
No.
It's a pretty good book. It's quite aligned with the whole relating to self kind of mindset. And it has a lot of exercises. It's all about preparing yourself for being ready to be the kind of husband, that the kind of wife that I would want as well, right? And so I'm doing those exercises. I'm kind of journaling about that. It's fun. It's interesting, but it's also really nice because it's so aligned with a lot of the work I've been doing for relating to self that it kind of comes easily to me.
Amazing. I love that. Is it written specifically for men?
No, it's clearly written for women mostly.
Huh.
But in the end, I think it's the same thing. It doesn't really matter.
Cool. How did you hear about it?
I think a friend of mine recommended it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm so excited for where the next chapter takes you, geographically as well.
Well, I have a flight to Japan in October. So I'm going to be in Asia for 7 or 8 months, probably, starting from then.
Nice. Bali as well.
Most probably.
Cool. Will you be sad to leave Sofia for a bit?
I don't know. If I left right now, I would not feel sad.
Cool. New chapter. Okay. For our last question, unless there's anything else you want to add, where can people follow along your journey if you want them to?
Wow, that's a difficult question now because, yeah, the podcast kind of stopped. The podcast is still there. People can still listen to the episodes. If you go to relatingtoself.com, then you can click through the podcast. I would say otherwise probably Instagram or Twitter. That's kind of where I sometimes express myself. I'm not very active on these platforms. But if anywhere, then this is where I would post my whereabouts or what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about, stuff like that. And my handle is always just my name, Joachim Brackx, Joachim Brackx, both on Instagram and on Twitter. So that makes me easy to find.
Are you still doing the Sunday sessions as well?
Which Sunday sessions exactly?
Oh, the monthly.
The month in review? Yeah, I was doing it until this month. And then I noticed that people weren't necessarily very interested to join anymore. And so I've also kind of honored that reality of like, oh yes, it looks like people don't need me hosting this for them. And that's okay. So I think I'll stop from now on.
Oh my God, cool. It's a fully new slate for the universe to bring in your manifestations. This is how I'm going to see the narrative of your life, even if you're not.
You are free to hold whichever story about me you like.
I am so excited. Okay. Wait, last question is, well, you can give us your 3 words if you want. I'm interested. I remember the last 2 episodes, what you said, so I'm interested. The 3 words that describe the best version of you.
3 words that describe the best version of me. Well, I guess that would have to be my core value still. It would be integrity, presence, and kindness.
Interesting, yeah. Integrity, you said it last time. But you said compassion last time. Yeah. And not kindness. So now kindness is something. Kindness was in the first one you said as well. Okay, and how you stay grounded?
I walk slowly. I try to be present to like the ground. I spend a lot of time in the forest, in nature, listening to the birds. And I sleep well. I think that's actually an underestimated hack. Just like good sleep. I go to bed when I'm tired. I wake up when I wake up. Never use an alarm clock. So I always feel rested. And also good nutrition, I guess. I hardly drink any alcohol or use any substances. And I'm quite mindful about what I put into my body. And I work out. And all these things help me to remain grounded.
Nice. And do you have another book suggestion, please? Because, I mean, it was like the book that's influenced you the most. The first time you said Brene Brown, what is it? The Imperfection one.
Gift of Imperfections.
Yes. Which I read. And then you said The Conscious Leadership. Oh, no, you said whoever, the author who wrote Clara and the Sun. I can't remember his name.
Oh, yeah. Kazuo Ishiguro.
Because I asked you for a novel. Yeah. And then you told us about the conscious leadership thing.
Yeah, 15 commitments of conscious leadership.
Which is so cool. I am obsessed with that.
Highly recommended. Highly recommended.
Okay, but do you have another non-fiction one?
Yeah. I'd probably say Existential Kink.
That's by...
I don't know if you've read it.
Is that Michael Singer?
No, it is not. I can't remember the author right now. Let me quickly look it up.
I think someone told me this book recently.
Yeah.
But
it's doing the rounds. Carolyn Elliott is the author.
And what's it about?
The core idea is that when there are things in your life that you say you don't want, but you don't do anything to get rid of them, then there's probably a part of you that secretly enjoys whatever pain you experience from that experience. So it's this idea of kink being, okay, some people enjoy pain in sex. That's weird because pain is supposed to be a signal that something's wrong. How can you enjoy that? Well, that apparently happens. And so it's the same in life. People say, oh, my husband is the worst person in the world. He's always nagging, always like, but they don't leave. So maybe they secretly enjoy that kind of pain that they experience from that relationship. And maybe they also secretly enjoy being able to complain about it to others so that they can get sympathy or whatever it is. So the book's premise is basically whatever is in your life right now is probably exactly what you want.
Yeah, I love thinking about that. Like, which part of you benefits from this bad situation?
Exactly.
And it might be,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, it gets, yeah, it's tough to talk about because obviously some people are in some horrendous situations.
Of course, but then she also goes into that. I mean, there's a difference between stories and beliefs that we have about ourselves that keep us in certain situations and actual violence in the world, right? You know, if I come to you and I have a gun and I force you to do things, then that is out of your control in a certain sense. That's not what that book is about.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yes, this is me being hypersensitive again. It reminds,
No, I hear you, and it's important. It's a good point.
but it is because it might not even be like they enjoy it or they're not even conscious of that, but it's like their identity is tied to that. Like my example of someone being in a job and saying, oh, well, I could never be free and just leave. But it's like part of them benefits from that, which might just be like, yeah, it feels safer to be in a framework where they feel like they have to be working for someone else at all times and they can't ever quit, even though they are like deeply suffering, crying every day in the butt. This was a friend of mine
Yeah.
in this exact
Yeah.
situation. But it's like, okay,
Yeah.
you are choosing to see that you have no other options because a part of you, I guess, needs to hold that belief to feel safe or something.
Yeah. A lot of people want to be domed, right? It's like when you think about this BDSM, dom sub kind of relationships, a lot of people prefer being domed by something that they perceive as negative in their lives because it removes the responsibility of making their own choices. It's easy in a way.
Huh. Yeah, it also reminds me of a tweet I just saw that was like, oh, how's your situationship going? Which one are you, the one who's scared of commitment or the one with low self-esteem? And I was like, fuck.
All of the above.
Funny. Okay.
Yeah.
Yay, thanks so much for chatting.
Of course. Always. Thanks for having me again.
I am so excited for what happens next. I have a calling to go to Bali for the first time. I've never been there, even though that's like
You've never
the
been?
place
Oh,
that
wow.
Australians go, or certain places.
Yes.
But I think
Yes,
I'm gonna go but it'll be like September, I think.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Ubud, I guess.
Ubud. Yeah,
Ubud.
that's the place.
Ubud.
For sure. I'll give you some recommendations. I'll tell you where to go.
Okay, please do. I'm stopping recording.